If you hadn't come along, Hey, just where did you come from?
The bog.
You don't have a still around here, do you? It doesn't matter. What matters is you saved my life. Thank you. My name's Dugan. Harry Dugan.
They call me Swamp Thing.
Hello and welcome to Comic Book Movie Oblivion, the podcast about feature films based on comic strips and comic books that people have stopped talking about. This week we are talking about the return of Swamp Thing from 1989. We are your hosts, Kumar and Jourdan. How are you doing, Jourdan?
Jourdan is but a dream. I am your only reality.
That was a Veronica callback for
Sure was.
For anybody who has no memory of that movie like me, or just didn't listen to it last week. Okay, Return of Swamp Thing from 1989. So where to start? Well, where to start? So I had seen this movie once. I think I caught it on... I saw it on TV, and I'm not sure why or what channel it would have been on in the 90s. And I saw it that one time, and I was just kind of in disbelief about it. I knew it was coming out. And then I watched it again last week and was shocked all over again. But there were certain things that stuck out to me, like the use of which I had forgotten about, like the use of the comic book covers.
Right.
Like the actual covers from the Alan Moore run of the series. So, we should have a little bit... Maybe I should go back in time a little bit. So in 1980... Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go, because you were going to talk about the comic. So
I was going to talk about... So in 1982, so Swamp Thing, there had been the Len Wein, Bernie Wrightson series from the 70s, and that died after, I think, 24 issues. Bernie Wrightson left around issue 12 or 10, I think, anyway. And then it kind of went off the rails.
Is this when the character was invented? Is that when the character was invented? He
was invented a little bit earlier than that as a character in House of Mystery. Okay. I want to say House of Secrets, issue 92. And it was like an 8-page story. It was like an Easy Comics horror story about this swamp creature that comes back and gets revenge, like something you'd see in Creepshow.
Yes.
And his real name was Alec Olson in that one-off. Then it was revived. That was drawn by Bernie Wrightson as well. Then it was revived as a series with Alec Holland with basically the origin, but a little bit more like more of a long-running storyline, obviously.
And he's a bit of Swamp Thing is kind of like a Hammer movie monster. He's man falls into pit of something, is turned into muck monster.
Yes.
Takes revenge or fights crime.
Yes, but an important point here is in the second series, he would lament his lost humanity and try to become human again. And this led Alan Moore to describing him as the Silver Surfer covered in snot, because that's kind of all he did was walk around issue to issue wishing he could be human again. So the rights were sold to make a movie, and we'll get into this a lot later on for what I'm about to reveal. So, and a movie was directed by Wes Craven, came out in 1982, and DC revived the comic book to tie in with the movie. And I think the second issue or the first annual had a photo cover from the movie.
Oh man, I never knew that. That's so interesting. But we're not talking about the Wes Craven movie.
No,
today.
We will eventually. Someday we will get to the Wes Craven movie. I actually think this one is more interesting or more fun to talk about because it's crazier. The Wes Craven movie actually... It's not bad for what it is. Like, it's got a good kind of... The story structure is pretty good, but it's cheap. It's really cheap. And that will all be explained in moments.
Okay.
Why all that is the way it is. So, where was I going with... Why did I backtrack all the way to...
I made you go back and talk about the origin of Swamp Thing.
Yeah, but
so now we have a comic...
movie. Okay. So,
the
Nick
reissue of the comic. Yep.
Right. Then at issue 16, we get an official new art team, Stephen Bissette, John Totleben, Rick Veitch. they were actually ghosting earlier. I didn't know that until this morning for reasons we're about to get to. The big reveal is coming, which will be in the episode description anyway, so I don't know why I'm hiding it.
This is exciting.
It's very exciting. It was exciting. Okay, so then Alan Moore comes on with issue 20. Issue 21 is the anatomy lesson. And now we get a run of 40 of some of the greatest comics of all time. Just spectacular.
I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it's probably the greatest comic of all time.
Could be. Yeah, every time I reread it, every time I read an awesome comic, I'm like, this is the one. But sure enough, every time I reread that run on Swamp Thing, I'm like, this is so perfect. Every issue is just a perfect little, like a little grape, like a little sweet grape that you eat, and it's just a perfect little hit of dopamine in your brain whenever you.
Brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant.
Okay, so when we decided, so I would say watch the 93 version, and I'm like, oh, it's got all these covers, and it cribbed a couple of plot points from the Alan Moore run. And
yes, barely.
So I sort of know Stephen Bissette from Facebook and from interviewing him on Deconstructing Comics. So I reached out to him, and I just had a few questions, which I've done before, just when I've just had random questions about Swamp Thing.
Stephen Bissette, one of the artists on the 1980s run.
Yeah, and I said, did you have any? Because the other thing is, Stephen is a mega movie nerd, horror movie nerd especially. He knows every little thing about as far as I can tell, about every little horror movie that's ever been made and was released to one cinema for 2 days in 1962 or whatever. He seems to know all this stuff. And he wrote this huge book about Cronenberg's The Brood that just came out a year or two back. And I was like, he was into movies and his work was being used as, did he know anything about it? And he said, well, we better chat. So
so he's agreed to appear on this podcast.
That's right. So I did an interview. I talked with him for about an hour. I knew from hearing him on other podcasts and from interviewing him previously that he would be a fount of information, and he totally was. So what we're going to do is we're going to run that interview. Oh, now I have to actually decide now how we're going to format this, because I thought I could wing it. I can't. Okay, we're going to run the interview, and then we're going to come back, and then we're going to do our talk about our usual discussion of this comic and movie. The only thing I'm going to leave in, I'm not going to edit out a little bit of the preamble, because we were on video chat, and I could see his archives. He was in this kind of huge space. It was just packed with like books and papers and just tons and tons of stuff. And we started chatting about that, and some of that comes up in the talk. And there's at one stage, I have the original art for the anatomy lesson, page 1, in my office. So I actually, when we were talking about the original art, at some stage I pulled that down and showed it to him, and that's maybe not clear from the way we're talking in the interview. So I just as a warning that that's going to be in there.
Right, about midway through the interview, Kumar says, "Look at this!"
Yes.
Well, what he's looking at is the original first page of issue 21, the anatomy lesson.
Yeah, and there was there was one or two other moments like that. It's probably not important. Oh, and early on, I hold up the novelization of Swamp Thing by Peter David, and that I think I say out loud what that is, so it's probably not issued. But okay, so with no further ado, let's run the interview.
This is one corner of it, and it continues.
Whoa!
And there are like 5 rows of floor-to-ceiling shelves, and this is what I'm wrestling with in my what I laughingly call my retirement.
Oh my gosh! So hadn't you donated a bunch of stuff to Billy Ireland or something? Like
I have donated 3.5 rooms of stuff to HUIE Library at Henderson State University.
Okay.
And that donation is up in the air right now. Apparently, the university is under new management, and I don't know if that stuff's going to be destroyed, warehoused. I also donated an entire carload, and when I say carload, I couldn't even get another piece of paper in the car of artwork from my collection to the Billy Ireland Museum.
Okay,
and I've also made donations to Columbia University, and I'm starting a process this winter of working with an official archivist to archive the rest of the collection to see if I can sell the rest to Columbia University because I've got so much stuff, and I've kept every scrap of paper from my career.
Amazing.
Everything up to Taboo, in terms of my business papers, is at Henderson State University. But I have everything else.
So they can like track your page rates over the years and things like that.
Oh yeah, I even had canceled checks. I mean, I had everything going back to my high school graduation in terms of, you know, my what I laughingly call my career.
Right. Okay.
What I held on to was the Swamp Thing stuff. I have all the original scripts from Alan and so on. Because when I was doing that work, nobody wanted the scripts after, you know, the issues were done. So I just held on to them.
Right.
And the original art I donated to Billy Ireland was the artwork that wasn't my work. It was all the other original art I had accumulated over the years. Bernie Wrightson, Al Williamson.
Wow.
Pretty good collection. Yeah. So anyway, and I see you have a collection behind you as well.
Yeah, this is meager. But it's actually and it seems random, but there's actually Alan Moore stuff is like the first two shelves, and then this Richard Corbin is like he's got a full couple of shelves there.
Oh yeah, I still have all my original Richard Corbin fanzines and underground comics, and I'm a huge Corbin fan too.
And everything else is kind of alphabetized, and there's some guitars on this side of the room. You can't see; it's like all action figures and all the toys.
Cool. Oh, those are all movie paperbacks back there. I have a huge collection of movie novelizations and paperbacks about making films. Over here are my oversized comics related collections. Carl Barks on the top.
Oh wow!
Et cetera, et cetera. And I've got 1, 2, 3 flat files of artwork that I'm still dealing with.
Okay.
So I don't know, a lot of shit.
Well, speaking of shit and novelizations, are you familiar with this one?
I have that. Oh yes, I have that.
So yes, I'm showing Steve here Return of the Swamp Thing by Peter David.
Yeah. I bought it off a paperback rack in Brattleboro, Vermont when it was brand new. So I'm glad you were up for a conversation because the stories associated with the return of Swamp Thing could not easily be summarized in an email response.
Yeah. So how this happened was, I've got this new podcast going. It's all about the more obscure movie adaptations of comics. And
how obscure?
Depends. The ones that people aren't really talking about as much. So like Friday Foster with Pam Grier was one.
Nobody talks about the St. Trinian's films out of the UK. Those were based on Ron Searle's gag comic about St. Trinian's.
Okay.
Nobody talks about Baba Yaga.
That's on the list.
Film. Oh, that's on your list. Okay.
It's on my list. We're going to do that one.
Nobody talks about, the Joe Palooka films from the 1940s. In fact,
that's on the list.
I used to trick my students with... I taught for 15 years at the Center for Cartoon Studies, and the comics history class was my class. Survey of the Drawn Story, they called it. And I would trick the students by saying, all right, what comic property was adapted into the most films? And of course, all the students are thinking about the contemporary.
Are there 28 Blondies?
It's Blondie. You win, Kumar. Oh my God. Yeah. It was Blondie. It was Blondie. But, nobody thinks about that stuff. And, you go back to the silent era when, filmmakers were they wouldn't even license the stuff. They would just say, oh, let's make let's.
Yeah.
So anyway, you got a lot of room to play there.
Yeah. Sure. So this one came up on our list, and I thought, I thought Steve Bissette is a guy that loves horror movies so much so that he'd write like a 700-page book about The Brood. And,
hey, thank you.
And has an inside line on Swamp Thing, and I thought maybe he's got some secret behind-the-scenes tidbits or something about this movie, because I heard you talk about 1941 on the SNL Nerds podcast, and I thought, are there some horror stories? I think this would have been after your 89. You would have been finished on Swamp Thing by the stage, right?
Actually, the process started while John Totleben and I were still working on the book. And it would have been in the latter part of the run. So I would have to dig back into the files to find what year, but we were initially contacted about the film while John and I were still actively working on Swamp Thing. It might have been after issue 64, and after that I did covers and I scripted, a handful of issues, or it might have been before that. But anyway, the entry point for John Totleben and I was we each got a phone call from one of our old Kubert School classmates, a fellow graduate by the name of John Bisson, Bisson.
Okay.
And go look on IMDb for John's credits, because he's got quite a list of credits under his work in special effects and makeup departments, and he was actually part of the KNVFX group for a time.
Okay.
And John had worked. John was out of New Jersey. John Bisson was out of New Jersey, and John, when he was a student at the Kubert School, and we were all friends. He wasn't a member of Rick Veitch's in my class. I think John Bisson was a member of Tim Truman's class.
Okay.
So that would have been the class after John Totleben. Rick Veitch and I graduated in 78. John Totleben only did 1 year at the Kubert School, but he would have been the class of 79.
Were you in the first year at the Kubert School? Is that right? The first year it was running?
Yeah. Rick Veitch and I, with Tom Yates and Kara Sherman-Torino and Ron Zalmi and a whole group of our friends, we were the first ever pioneer class at the Kubert School. So John Bisson, I believe, was part of the third class that came in. And if I'm misremembering, forgive me, John, please. It would have been either the second or third class, but I'm pretty sure John Bisson was in the third class. And right from the start, John Bisson made it clear that his goal was to work on special effects makeup.
Okay.
Now, at that time, Dick Smith was a big star in the firmament of special effects and makeup design. Tom Savini had not yet come into his own. In fact, while we were at the Kubert School, a group of us drove to Morristown, New Jersey, and we saw Dawn of the Dead, opening matinee. So Savini was just beginning his trajectory.
Yeah.
But John Bisson already, that was where he wanted to go. He was an excellent cartoonist and artist. But he, his desire was to work in 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
To create creatures. So John Totleben and I stayed in touch with a lot of our old classmates and friends from the Kubert School, Ron Randall, Tom Mandrake and Jan Dursema, who got married at the Kubert School. And John Bisson was one of that circle of friends, including Tim Truman and so on. And John Bisson called John Totleben and I out of the blue, saying he was going to bid for the makeup job on the return of the Swamp Thing. And that's the first any of us had heard about a sequel.
Okay. Now, so my understanding, was...
No, go ahead.
I guess that Saga of the Swamp Thing was launched as a series in order to kind of tie in or promote the Wes Craven movie initially.
Well,
right?
Yeah, that's what the reason for the launch of the new series.
Right, because I had a photo cover on one issue.
Right. Marty Pasco was the writer. Tom Yates was the artist. And Tom Yates was another member of that pioneer class at the Kubert School.
Yeah.
Okay, I was kind of saving Tom's name, but here it is. Now, a couple of things you to understand that we didn't know at the time. In fact, I only found out because of Return of the Swamp Thing.
Right.
What led to the Wes Craven film being made was that DC so undervalued Swamp Thing as a property that they sold Swamp Thing lock, stock, and barrel to Melniker and Uslan, the production team.
Okay.
Right? DC, owned by Warner Brothers, were very controlling about the deal on allowing Melniker and Uslan to have adaptation rights to Batman.
Okay.
But they practically gave away Swamp Thing.
Okay.
In fact, the only rights that DC retained, Kumar, were comic book rights. That's why there were no posters.
Wow.
There was no advertising for Saga of the Swamp Thing outside of inside DC Comics.
Okay.
They had nothing to win.
Okay.
They had nothing to gain because they had already sold off all the merchandising rights to Melniker Uslan.
Okay.
And that's why every merchandising item that came out, and there were none that came out. Well, I shouldn't say none. There were very few that came out in connection with the Wes Craven film.
Yeah.
But once there was the animated TV series, and later when there was the live action cable series, any merchandising, that was all Melniker and Uslan's license.
Right.
But not license any of that. None of the toys, none of the puzzles, not even the fuzzy slippers that were merchandise.
So were you looking forward to the Wes Craven movie? This was well before you.
I was a huge Wes Craven fan. I mean, I had seen Last House on the Left when it opened back in 72, yeah. I had seen the one that blew me away was The Hills Have Eyes. That's still one of my favorite 70s, horror films. Wes Craven was, man, he was sharp.
Yeah.
And he was angry.
Yeah.
And he had a very distinctive voice and vision apart from contemporaries like David Cronenberg, Tobe Hooper, John Carpenter. Craven had his own edge. Mm-hmm. And it carried over even into his made-for-TV movies. Summer of Evil, based on the Lois Duncan, YA novel about Linda Blair and her cousin who's a witch from the Ozarks, So, yeah, I was looking forward to the Wes Craven film. Now, I was a little leery because the reports that were coming out, it was obvious that something, we didn't know what at that time, but something major was going on at Avco Embassy.
Okay.
Right? The production studio and the distributor of the Swamp Thing film. Later, what we found out is the company had changed hands. It had been bought by Norman Lear and his partners, and they hated horror. Right? And prior to their acquisition of Avco Embassy had been one of the cutting-edge distributors of some of the key horror films that came out. Phantasm was an Avco Embassy release.
Okay.
Scanners. They got big behind Scanners. Scanners was everywhere when it came out, and that was the breakthrough hit for Cronenberg. But by the time Swamp Thing was being produced, the writing was already on the wall. And by the time the film came out, it played for, if I remember correctly, it played for 3 days at the Paramount Theater in Brattleboro, Vermont, southern Vermont, the part of the state I was living in, and was gone.
Yikes.
And, they dumped it. Films like The Boogans got more play than Swamp Thing in our part of New England. I saw the film, on the big screen when it played at the Paramount in Brattleboro. I enjoyed it, but the impoverished nature of the production was self-evident on the screen.
Right.
Wes had done a pretty good job with what he had to work with, but Bill Munns, the makeup designer, took a lot of heat. But they were working with almost no money by the time they got down there, and they were shooting it in swamps.
Yeah.
The water down there eats rubber.
Yeah.
So, a lot of the makeup looked as threadbare as it was because the environment was actually another detriment against Craven's creative team.
Right.
But, the film was fun. It was a perfectly good matinee, which is how I saw it. I still love catching horror movies at matinees. It's often the best way to see them. And then it vanished. And it wasn't until we didn't get TV, by choice. We lived in the deep woods. There's no cable in southern Vermont. There's still no cable in Marlborough, Vermont, where I was living at that time. So we didn't see network or cable television at all. It wasn't until we visited my first wife, Marlene's parents in Lynn, Massachusetts, that I realized Swamp Thing was playing on HBO. In fact, Swamp Thing was playing on HBO a lot. I remember a friend jokingly saying, you know what HBO means? Hey, Beastmaster's on. Swamp Thing was one of the films, along with Don Casarelli's Beastmaster, that was just, cycling again and again and again on HBO and cable stations. So that's how we heard rumors there might be a follow-up, because it certainly wasn't because of comic book sales. Our numbers on Swamp Thing were very low, Kumar. We never saw actual sales figures, but I can give you ballpark what we were told. The book was near cancellation when John Totleben and I started our stint as the art team with Saga of the Swamp Thing number 16. That would have been in 1983. It was near cancellation, which meant 16,000 copies or so were probably what it was selling. And 16,000 sounds like a lot in 2022 in the direct sale market, but it was a newsstand comic. And 16,000 is like, nobody ever connected with the Swamp Thing comic ever saw royalties. The book never sold enough to earn royalties off the comic book, the periodical. By the time Alan Moore had come on with issue 20, and by the time we lost the comic book code with Swamp Thing number 29, we were told the sales really were climbing. And when we lost the comics code, that meant the comic couldn't be sold on the newsstand anymore. They were going to cease submitting the book to the code. So we were a direct sale only, meaning only sold to comic book stores. But that also means it was no longer returnable. Newsstand sales are returnable. And direct sale market, they know what they've sold. And the last time we were told the number was it had gone up to 60,000. So we had considerly upped, the sales visibility of the comic book.
Was that 60 including newsstand?
There was no newsstand by that. So 60,000 copies direct sale.
Direct market. Got it.
And that's up from 16,000 when it was newsstand only. John Bisson calls John Totleben and I same day. He says, guys, I'm going to try out for the makeup special effects gig for Return of the Swamp Thing. Really? They're making a movie? So we kind of pumped John Bisson as to, what he knew. And he knew he was going to be up against a New York, New Jersey-based makeup effects guy that he had worked with on another production, which was a guy named Ed French. And indeed, Ed French ended up doing the makeup for the Jim Wynorski Return of the Swamp Thing. Here's how he got it. So John Bisson said, guys, I'd love to go into the interview saying I know you and being able to show them some sort of material evidence. And so Totleben and I made up fresh designs for monsters. I designed like a snapping turtle monster. John Totleben worked up like a leech humanoid monster. And we FedExed the drawings to John Bisson. He said, how quick can you get them to me? And we said, we'll FedEx them. So we sent the drawings to John Bisson. So John Bisson goes to the interview for the makeup gig on Return of the Swamp Thing. And he's got original designs by Totleben and Bissette, the guys doing the book. And John Bisson hoped that was going to be a perk. Ed French, this is what John Bisson told us, very dejected after he lost the kid. Ed French heard this and reminded Melniker and Uslan, you guys already own anything in the comic book. You don't have to get involved with these cartoonists. You already own everything DC's done. And that became one of the ways, apparently, that French got the gig. And again, I'm relating to you from memory, a phone conversation from, 1987, maybe? And please forgive me, John Bisson, and please forgive me, Ed French, if I'm misremembering anything here. But our understanding was the deciding factor of John Bisson not even being in the running is that his bringing in our work was a detriment to him getting the job, not a positive. Because our being involved would mean more money.
Yeah.
Ed French said, you don't have to involve these guys. You already own all the work they've done in the comic book. You don't need to pay them.
Brutal.
This one, Ed French the gig, or it was a factor in whatever the dialogue was. So we knew the film was being made, and I knew who Jim Wynorski was. I didn't know Jim Wynorski, but I knew who he was because I'd seen his work, including the trailer for Screamers, where Roger Corman cooked up a campaign that Jim Wynorski apparently had tailored, claiming that a man was turned inside out on the screen in the movie Screamers, and there was no such scene in the film, and so they had to pay Chris Wallace to make a scene, that fit that. So we knew it was low budget. We knew Jim Wynorski was doing it. And much as I love a lot of Jim Wynorski's work, I'm a big fan of Dinosaur Island. Look it up, Kumar.
Okay.
Fred Olen Ray and Jim Wynorski, collaborated and co-directed Dinosaur Island. And it's really cheesy, but it's a lot of fun. We knew they had it. And this led to the only phone conversation I ever had in my life with Paul Levitz, who at that time was head honcho along with Jeanette Kahn at DC Comics. And the reason Paul was calling me was because I knew more about the film than DC knew. Okay.
Wow.
And that's when, I basically in a polite way said, well, tit for tat, right? And that's when Paul Levitz told me, well, Steve, you need to know we don't own any licensing or merchandising. And that's when we found out why we were the lowest paid cartoonists and writers at DC Comics.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Swamp Thing paid the lowest page rate because there was no licensing revenue.
Oh, my God.
Even potential for DC Comics. So we were doing all that work at the lowest rates that the company was paying at that time. And now we understood why. We didn't understand... by this time we had ascertained this because of another job I did for Ambush Bug, where the editor, Julie Schwartz, on the phone said, I'm doing you a favor, Steve, and I hear paper tearing. And he was tearing up my invoice.
Okay.
And he said, what is this page rate? And I said, that's what I get on Swamp Thing. And he says, no, we're going to pay you Keith Giffen's page rate. And it was more than twice what I was
Yikes. Holy. Okay.
And that's when I found out, Paul Levitz told me that DC had completely sold at a bargain basement deal. In fact, Paul Levitz called it, and I believe I'm paraphrasing him correctly, the worst merchandising deal DC had ever cut for any property that was on Swamp Thing.
Yeah.
Thus, relevant to your wanting to talk to me, Kumar, DC had no control over the production.
Okay.
They had no say in what the Return of the Swamp Thing might be or could be. And they didn't know what was going on with the film at all. They had no idea. And all we knew, we meaning me and John Totleben, is what our friend John Bisson had told us.
Okay.
And after that, DC could read in Fangoria. That's what I was reading in Fangoria,
Okay, so you came on to Swamp Thing issue 16, and you immediately did the Leafy redesign, right? Like right off the bat?
No, actually, John Totleben is the one of the group of us. Meaning, Tom Yates, who was the regular artist on Saga the Swamp Thing from issue 1 to 15.
Yeah.
Rick Veitch, who was part of our collective, and Rick was working with. Here's how it went. Tom Yates got the gig as an artist.
Yeah.
Len Wein was the editor, co-creator of Swamp Thing.
Yes.
Len Wein broke some kind of logjam there was at DC where there was some kind of edict that they were not supposed to hire Joe Kubert's students.
Oh, okay.
But we'd been going up there, individually and together at times for possible job interviews, and we could never get work. We could get work from Marvel. We could get work from Heavy Metal. I was working with Scholastic magazine. We couldn't get a gig at DC.
Did they ever give you a reason?
There was some kind of grunt. So we have never discovered what it was. There was some kind of axe to grind with Joe Kubert, but nobody was going to talk about it because Joe was still working with DC, and they didn't want to piss Joe off. Joe could be very intimidating, We didn't know what was going on, and it was Len Wein that finally bucked it, and basically, took the risk of hiring Tom Yates. And that opened the door. Tom Yates began doing individual stories for Tales of the Unexpected, House of Mystery, House of Secrets, and that kind of, then incrementally, some of the others of us were being able to get our foot in the door. But Len was the one that said, Yates is the one for Swamp Thing. That was his pick for the artist. And he wouldn't do the series. I believe I'm correct in saying he wasn't going to do the series unless Tom Yates got the draw.
Okay.
And Marty Pasco was an old friend of Len Wein's, and Marty was the designated writer.
Okay.
The reason I'm giving you all this backstory is Tom was penciling and inking every issue.
Okay.
The book started behind schedule.
Okay.
Because they were trying to tie it in with the Wes Craven film.
Yeah.
Okay. So Tom started against the 8 ball. So starting with issue 2, John Totleben, who was still living in that part of New Jersey, I had moved back to Vermont in the summer of '79. Rick Veitch was shuttling between Grafton, Vermont, and New Jersey. He kept, a room in both places. John was still living in the Dover, New Jersey area. Tom was living in Hopatcong, New Jersey. And starting with issue 2, John was ghosting, working with Tom Yates. In fact, I can look back at that Saga of the Swamp Thing #2, and I can cherry pick which figures John penciled. Okay. Then Rick began helping Tom Yates. So from issue 2 to 4, John and Rick were, essentially assisting whenever necessary to help Tom make the deadlines, because the deadlines are tough.
Yeah.
On a monthly or a bi-monthly comic. And my first pitch in was with Saga of the Swamp Thing #8, which I laid out.
Okay.
And Tom snuck my initials. It says layouts SRB under the dinosaur's tail on the splash page. If you want to turn it upside down, you can spot it somewhere. And I also did some work on issue 13, and by then Tom had made it clear he was leaving. He was not having fun with them. Tom is an adventure cartoonist.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's not interested in horror. He's not interested in monsters so much. And Tom let us know he was leaving, and he suggested that Totleben and I together try out for the gig.
Okay.
And so John and I were in Hopatcong, New Jersey, doing a Dungeon and Dragon toy design sweatshop that Tim Truman was supervising for TSR Incorporated. And during the day, John and I were part of the, Kubert School alumni that were working on this toy design project. And at night, John and I would go back to our rooms, and we worked up our samples that at the end of that gig, we gave to Tom Yates, and he brought up to Len Wein. And we did samples where I penciled a 3-page sequence and John inked it. And we did another set of samples where John penciled a 3-page sequence and I inked it.
Okay.
And we also did some character portraits, Arcane, Black Jubal, that alien that Bernie Wrightson had designed from the original run. And the Demon. We did a character sketch of Etrigan, the Demon. And Len looked at the samples. We got the gig, and he said, right, Bissette's the better storyteller. He pencils. Tolleben's got the better line. He inks. And that was how we were put together. And we started on issue 16.
Yeah.
But the book was so far behind schedule at this point. Marty Pasco would phone me pages.
Right.
I wasn't getting script. I was getting phone calls from Marty, and he would dictate 3 or 4 pages to me, and then I would transcribe. I would do the pencils, and Marty was scripting. Well, Marty was scripting a lot of Saturday morning animation, which paid much better, than comics at that time. So that situation became either untenable for Len, or Marty told Len, I'm going to leave the book. Either way, we were told there was a new writer, and it was a guy we'd never heard of from England called Alan Moore. And Totleben and I don't think Len believed us. We went, Alan Moore, we love his work, because we had been buying Warrior, British magazine. As it was available in the US, we would pick it up at comic shops, and we were reading V for Vendetta and Marvel Man. So we knew Alan's work, and we were like, oh my God, this is like dream come true. And we were so far behind on the deadlines. This is how it worked, Kumar. Dan Day did very, very, very rough pencils for issue 20, which was Alan Moore's first script.
Mm-hmm.
And I was already penciling the next issue, issue 21, which was Alan's second script. Okay. And those two issues had to be done simultaneously. Yeah. So wow. John Totleben had to ink both issues in about a 4 or 5 week period of time. And John has related to me. He remembered a phone call at one point from Len saying, you know, if these don't happen, that's the end of the book. And you know, we didn't want to lose our gig. We were just starting. And that first script, I got the pencil from Alan. I mean, it's still one of the best things I've ever done and that I'll ever have a hand in. I mean, that was just like a mind-blowing. The anatomy lesson was just, it was the best comic script I had ever read.
I'll show you something.
Oh!
Look at this.
You've got the original?
I've got the original. I bought this. I bought this in 1996 or so, back when it was like Usenet groups.
Yeah.
And at the time, I paid about $700 for it. But I was working at McDonald's for $5 an hour.
That was a lot of money.
That was a lot of time.
You know, we probably sold that for $75.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, in the 80s, the way that John, I have the last page of that issue right up here.
Okay.
So, and it's the companion to that page, as you know. So.
Yes.
Wow, I'm glad you have that. I'm glad you have that.
It's all the way across on the other side of the world, and it's living in Melbourne.
You know, the last page I sold of Swamp Thing went for a lot more than $700. Mm-hmm. And I don't sell the pages anymore. I sold one cover to a really, really, really dedicated collector for more money than I ever thought I'd ever get for a piece of art. And I then had to sell an original to pay the taxes for what I got for that cover. Right. So I just stopped selling Swamp Thing art at that point.
Right. So when you saw the first images from Return, maybe it was in Fangoria or Comic Scene or somewhere, and you saw that leafy design and you saw that it was the design that you guys had come up with or something.
Well, remind me, was the cable series before or after Return of the Swamp Thing?
Oh,
you know, I'm going to look it up while we're talking.
Yeah,
I'll keep talking, but I'm going to look.
It was after all that stuff was after the cartoon, and the cable series was after. So the movie came first, and that seemed to be successful enough. I don't know that it led to the cable series.
Let's see. I think you're right.
So it would have been
90, I think.
Yeah. So like a year, the next year.
Okay, so Return of the Swamp Thing was 89.
Yeah.
Okay, and this was the link. Was Dick Durock, who had played Swamp Thing in the Wes Craven film, was back to play Swamp Thing. And when we saw the first images, which is what your question is, we knew they were working from our comic book designs.
Yeah.
We knew it. Right?
Yeah.
And we had already, you know, absorbed the sad lesson of the phone call from John Bisson.
Yeah.
We would have been much happier if our buddy John Bisson was working on the movie. But, you know, Ed French had done some pretty amazing makeup work on other films. And I knew, you know, he was capable of pulling off, realizing in 3 dimensions, the kind of visual imagery that we had worked up on the character. Oh, and to answer your earlier question, John Totleben was the one who first proposed in a drawing he'd done the more leafy, mossy, elemental version of Swamp Thing. And Len Wein, Tom Yates showed that drawing to Len Wein, and Len Wein rejected it. He was like, no, that's too extreme.
Yeah.
Then, when Alan Moore was brought on the book, Len by then had been working with John and I for, 4 issues, because it was Alan Moore, and this is pre-internet, and we didn't have each other's phone. Well, John and I had each other's phone numbers, but we were establishing contact with Alan Moore. These long letters, our first letters to each other, crossed in the mail, and we all wanted to do the same thing with the character. Alan wanted to go exactly where John Totleben had been talking about the character going back in, the 70s when we first met John. He was talking about that. So really, it was John Totleben's vision.
Yeah.
And before any of us were working on the book, there was a party, a Kubert School student party that Rick Veitch, John Totleben were sitting in the kitchen. And that's where the whole brainstorming about the hallucinogenic potatoes came from.
Right.
That was like a drunken conversation, a stoner conversation between Totleben, Rick Veitch, and that I came in on. But it was Rick and John that had brainstormed. So we were bringing all that to the character. Once Alan was on the book, all bets were off. Len was suddenly much more receptive to where we went. So by the time we saw the first photos from Return of the Swamp Thing, we were like, wow. I mean, it looked really good.
It did look the suit's the best thing about it, yeah.
Our problem was Heather Locklear. No offense to Heather Locklear as Abby, right? Yeah, we see Heather Locklear as Abby, and we're just like, what the fuck? Pardon my French, right? So, and then, I remember at one point seeing a photo of the Leech Man, and it was so close to John Tolleben's drawing.
Yeah, right.
That he had sent to John Bisson.
Yeah. That,
our radar was kind of up. Like, what the hell? Because that had never appeared in the comic book.
Yeah.
So, and I didn't have any illusions, nor did John. I mean, we'd grown up watching, Teenagers from Outer Space. And,
sure.
The Brain from Planet Aroused. We didn't have any illusions.
So
about what budget range this adaptation was going to be.
So when and how did you see it? Did you catch it on? Did you actually see it in a cinema? Or you'd see it on TV or something?
It
or
never
VHS?
played in Vermont.
Okay.
It opened in New York City.
Okay.
But it didn't open big in New York. It played like 1 week only at one of the theaters downtown. And I remember calling Karen Berger. I lived in Vermont. Calling Karen Berger and saying, Karen, is there any way, John and I can get tickets to the movie? Now, one thing you got to understand, Kumar, when I was working for Marvel, I freelanced for Marvel off and on from 77 until 82. When I was working on something for Marvel, if I had to go into New York, or if they called us into New York, they said, keep your bus ticket and your train ticket and we'll reimburse you. Okay. When we went into DC, it was on our head. They didn't pay for anything, right?
Jesus, okay.
So a trip to New York was an expensive undertaking.
Yep.
It was a bus or a train ride. It was a day or two lost at the drawing board. And I had kids. John and his wife, Michelle, didn't have their kids as yet, but I had kids. I had two kids, daughter Maya, who was born in 83, and son Daniel, who was born in 85. And so, hey, Marlene, I'm going to leave you with the kids to go see Return of the Swamp Thing in New York. That wasn't going to fly. And Karen said, well, no, we can't get you a ticket. She said, if you want to go, you bring me the ticket, we'll reimburse you the cost of the ticket, right? So I didn't go to New York to see the Return of the Swamp Thing.
Okay.
And I don't know if you've ever seen them. You might be able to look them up online. The newspaper ads for Return of the Swamp Thing look awful. Like it didn't even look like the Ed French makeup on Dick Durock. It looked like the Jolly Green Giant from the vegetable ads.
Yeah. Okay.
Very humanoid face, leafy head, and they were playing it up as a camp film.
Right.
They were playing it up as a ridiculous entertainment.
Which it is.
Which it is. I mean, that aspect of the ads was very true. So I didn't see it. It didn't play anywhere in Vermont. It didn't pop up we still had drive-ins, did not pop up at the drive-ins, did not get any theatrical play anywhere in driving distance. I don't even think it played Boston, but I was not tracking the Boston papers at that time. But I know it did not play in northern Massachusetts because I used to go to Greenfield and Springfield, Mass all the time to see movies. Movies like revered classics like Videodrome and The Thing, those bombed. And those were the movies I couldn't see in Vermont. I would have to drive the hour or more down into northern Mass to see. Return of the Swamp Thing didn't even get that close to it. The way I first saw it was via VHS.
Okay.
And the way I first saw it wasn't in one of our VHS rental stores. It was in a little mom and pop grocery in South Newfane, Vermont. And it was a little grocery store I used to stop at when I would take a route home to where my first wife and I lived in Marlborough, Vermont. I drive through South Newfane, stop at this store to pick up milk. And there, on their rental rack, they had like a few racks that were, racked by some local guy. There's Return of the Swamp Thing, and I believe it was RCA Columbia release on VHS here in the States. So I rented. I paid my, whatever it was, $2, $3 to get home. And so, my first wife and I made popcorn, and we sat down and watched it, and I was so depressed at the end of it. I didn't sleep that whole night, Kumar, because I was like, is this what our work looked like to people? Like, is this what our stuff, read like to people? And then by the next morning, I was talking myself out of it, and Marlene got up and she could tell I hadn't slept, and she said, "Don't be silly. That was a piece of shit, and your work has been, what you guys did on the comic was great, and that has nothing to do with it." So I watched it again with my kids, and it was a fun. Then I could watch it with a certain amount of distance. So the hard part was seeing our covers.
Yes, so those I had two very specific questions. One was the cover. So did you have any inkling that they were going to use your drawings in this movie in the opening credits? No. And I assume they spent the entire budget for the music rights for CCR. Because
well, I don't know. Remember, Creedence Clearwater didn't own their own music.
Oh,
so
shit.
In a way, Creedence Clearwater, the money went to whoever that shyster was. That,
oh my God.
That John Fogerty later did that song.
Everything about this is shady now. Even the credits, which I thought there was some kind of class in the credits, but no. So
we did get. John and I each got. If I remember correctly, it was a bonus of $700 for our artwork appearing in the, and that was money from DC, right?
Yeah.
Now, a bonus is not a royalty. A bonus is like a gift. Like, oh, boys, here,
I think that's still how DC does. I think they still pay
we
bonuses.
Get royalties. We get quarterly royalties
Okay.
for our comic book work, and we get quarterly royalties for John Constantine, because John Totleben and I co-created John Constantine.
Right.
We have been earning royalties every quarter since 1988 or 89, when the first paperbacks came out.
Okay, so they use
those are bonuses, but the DC, the use of our cover art, earned us each, a surprise bonus of $700.
Yeah. Okay, so surprise bonus. So that's good. At least that's something. Let's talk about the other thing I want to ask very specifically about was the Rite of Spring scene. In which Swamp Thing breaks off.
What do you think depressed me the most?
Oh, so this is the one moment that's very specifically like they took one of the most emotional issues of Swamp Thing. It's still with me after all these years in the whole visual, the narrative level, everything about it. And they somehow in this cocaine-fueled rampage turned it into this crusty dildo that he breaks off and hands to her, and he turns into a human man. So I'm guessing you had no idea this is what was going to happen until you saw it happening on screen.
Yeah, and it was painful.
Yeah.
now I watch it and I laugh. I mean, I bought the Blu-ray when it came out. I had it on DVD. I can revisit it and laugh. But that first night, it was like, and I'll tell you something, that issue, when we were collaborating, John Totleben, Alan Moore, myself, Rick Veitch, we were trading story ideas. And that issue came from a postcard I sent Alan. I had just finished penciling. I think I had just finished penciling the annual number 2, Down Amongst the Dead Men.
Yeah.
And I wrote a postcard to Alan saying, if Abby was a real person, she would be in a mental asylum at this point. Why don't we do one issue where Abby and Swamp Thing just have a really good day in the swamp?
Yeah.
And that was it. That was what I put it on a postcard and I mailed it to Alan, and he got the postcard, and it turned that's what turned into Rites of Spring. Is Alan went, that's a great idea, and Alan being Alan, he took it much further than the notion that had been put in his hands. And it was a romance comic, but it's also the closest we ever got to an underground comic book, because when I was drawing it, I was tapping into Greg Irons, my favorite underground cartoonist. Greg Irons had an amazing comic called Light, which was transformative images, page to page, forms that would just shift. And there's a lot of Greg Irons, directly hardwired into Rites of Spring. So when I saw that in the movie, it was like, it was like watching, it was like watching some biker movie stealing a Stan Brakhage underground movie, and turning it into a biker wheelie acid trip or something. I don't know.
I think what's especially shocking to me is after this whole ridiculous 86-minute movie, the final shot is your very poignant cover of the final issue with them walking off in silhouette into the swamp, which is another image that's burned into my mind. And I'm like, I can't believe they didn't earn the right to use this as if they'd made some really significant film. It knows its schlock for 86 minutes, and then suddenly in the last frame, it suddenly tries to turn on a dime.
Within the vernacular, let's face it, okay, doing Return of the Swamp Thing was a step up production-wise for Jim Wynorski. Right?
Okay, right.
This wasn't Chopping Mall, this wasn't another Corman production for New World Pictures. This was a step up for Jim Wynorski, and he does a pretty slick job directing it. And lurid and ridiculous as it is, it's not a total TNA fest.
Yes.
And it's not a gore fest. I mean, he made as close as he could get to a kid's monster movie.
Yeah.
Right. And in terms of, you and I are talking about it, and I couldn't help but see it that first night in the context of what, a group of us had done with a comic book that we poured our hearts and souls into for a few years. But I got to look at it as a Jim Wynorski film, and it's a pretty fucking good Jim Wynorski film, right? And he has no pretensions.
Yeah.
So framing his production with Bernie Wrightson and Nestor Redondo and Tom Yates and Johns and my artwork at the beginning, and ending it with that cover, was a pretty strong and gracious grace note. I mean, it really frames the movie, and it's an aspect of class that Wynorski was bringing to this film that he had never been able to bring to a film before that. Okay?
Yeah, right.
So I've got to look at it. I try to watch all films, hard as it is sometimes. And this is a particularly tough one, Kumar. But I try to watch all films on their own terms. I try to go with no expectations. And it was impossible for me to watch Return of the Swamp Thing the first time with no expectation. I couldn't, I was too close to the material. Now I look at it and I can see it in the fuller context of Wynorski's career. And man, he did a really good job. It's not slow. It's not boring. It's not, I mean, let's compare it with a comparable film from the same time period. It is much better than the Garbage Pail Kids movie. much better than the Garbage Pail Kids movie. But it falls way short of, say, Mars Attacks.
Right.
Okay. But Tim Burton had way more resources at his fingertips in anything, Tim Burton ever did than Wynorski had on Return of the Swamp Thing. And he made the most of what he had to work with. Dick Durock gives Durock always gave heartfelt performances playing Swamp Thing. Even on that, not very good live action TV series. Even in those environmental commercials.
The PSAs.
Durock always was, his earnestness and his integrity comes across in that suit. Heather Locklear gave a Heather Locklear performance. It was playful. It was
She's got some funny lines in there.
It's just not our Abby. That's what was hard. That's what was hard to take on first viewing. It's not our Abby.
Now you were in the video store business yourself. Was that after 80? Was that?
Yeah, that was after. I was invited in by Alan Goldstein, who used to run Moondance comic books. They had the one-page ads in Marvel Comics where you could buy back issues.
Yep.
And Alan opened a brick-and-mortar retail shop, comic retail shop in Brattleboro, Vermont, and he had a couple of other branches elsewhere in New England. And then in 1990 and 91, he, with an old friend of mine, Steve Perry, who's no longer with us, had the idea for this video superstore in Southern Vermont, the first one. And I was pulled into that. In fact, it was not a pleasant task. I became the mediator when that partnership fell apart between Alan and Steve. But it was necessary for that to happen for First Run Video to open. And I was a shareholder from 91 to 2005. And I actively worked at First Run Video for about 2 years. I was promotional manager, I think, in 92 and 93. And then I became a member of the staff and worked my way up to co-manager and buyer by 1999. And I stayed on until March of 2005. This is all long after Return of the Swamp Thing.
So how much was movies like Return of the Swamp Thing and, say, Carnosaur and all those movies that are filling, all those Roger Corman movies, the mockbusters that are filling the shelves, how much is that part of the bread and butter of the video rental business?
Oh yeah. And at
that time,
like that, I mean, when Return of the Swamp Thing came out, that was probably an $89.95 retail tape.
Yeah, right.
Okay, I mean, rental customers didn't understand this, you know.
Yeah.
And then there'd be like a breakthrough, like Raiders of the Lost Ark. You could get it for $15 at McDonald's. Your rental customers suddenly thought every tape in the store cost $15. No way. I mean, when a lot of those movies first came out, you know, the retail prices were $79.95 to $120.95, and but those films were staples of rental stores. Now, we had a section. I mean, Alan Goldstein, co-founder, and then founder of First Run Video, had been selling comic books for a living for a decade or so. So it was a given, whether I was going to be involved or not, that there was going to be a section of comic book movies in First Run Video. Of course, once I was involved, and I was right from the get-go, my job before opening week was I was the guy that divided up all the tapes into genres and supervised the racking. So we had a comic book section, and it wasn't just a little end cap in a row. It was like we had a good run of comic book movies, and this is long before the Marvel Comics universe. And Batman was the biggest comic book movie. The Tim Burton Batman movie was the biggest comic book movie at that time. And Superman, the Richard Donner Superman from '78. Everything else was like, made for TV, Amazing Spider-Man,
28 Blondies.
I had a couple Blondies in the mix, but only a couple. That wasn't going to fly. It's funny because Steve Perry was a big Blondie fan. He would have been all over it. A lot of that stuff wasn't available on VHS. I mean, those old Columbia, but I remember grabbing a Snuffy Smith.
Oh, right.
There's a comic book derived, feature. I think there's 2 Snuffy Smith movies. We had one of them in our rental section. So, but Flash Gordon,
right?
Both the Buster Crab serial, the Buster Crab cut down of the serial into features, and the Dino De Laurentiis film. Flash Gordon, the Dino production made us a lot of rental money at that store. And when you ask about things like Carnosaur, Jurassic Park was big, but it wasn't on video yet. So we had probably 16 copies of Carnosaur.
Right. So did that, I'm just wondering if it colored your feelings about Return of Swamp Thing after working in video.
That's why I said to you what I said, that in the context of Wynorski's body of work, it's one of his better films, and I by the time I had survived my scathing initial experience with it, I came around to that perspective pretty quickly. I also, I have to say there weren't many comic derived movies that I gave a rat's ass about. My favorite was Danger Diabolic, the Mario Bava.
Yes, right.
I still think that's one of the best early adaptation. And I would argue Danger Diabolik and Frank Miller and Robert Rodriguez's Sin City are probably the two films that come closest to really understanding how comics work and really understanding how cinema works and making the leap. And the best of all comic book movies to me is American Splendor.
Yeah.
Because it transcends anything
Absolutely.
ever talk about in terms of comic book or comic strips being adapted to film. American Splendor took it to a whole new meta level and did so brilliantly. And, I was friends with Harvey Pekar and his wife, Joyce Brabner. I knew them. I'd spent time with them at conventions. I had worked with Joyce Brabner on a couple of projects. So that film American Splendor hit me on as personal level as Return of the Swamp Thing did.
Yeah,
but in a way more positive way. But I would argue that just in terms of all the aesthetic issues of adapting any comics material to cinema, Danger Diabolik and Sin City, the first Sin City, are still my favorites. I don't know if I could argue they were the best, but they're certainly my favorites because I know the filmmakers grasped all the essentials of both art forms and understood what had to change and what would carry over. And that's rare. There's comic book derived, TV series and movies that I treasure. The Addams Family TV series from the 60s is still a lot of fun to watch. But, Charles Addams got to work on finessing those single panel cartoons into what became the Bible for that series. And so there's a lot of the personality of Charles Addams in that first series. And a lot of that does continue to carry over into both the live action and the CGI feature films. But that's pretty rare too. The genre that you're focusing on is a fascinating genre, but a lot of times, I'll give you a for instance, and forgive me for, detouring for a moment.
No, keep going.
When Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy came out, I mean, I enjoyed the movie for what it was, but it's a mess, and there's no Chester Gould there.
That's right.
And Chester Gould, I have to remind you and your listeners and your viewers, Chester Gould scripted and drew one of the most terrifying comics I ever read as a kid. Because the fates he would prepare for the villains when they finally got their comeuppance was really disturbing stuff, right? The movie that Dick Tracy should have been was Michael Ritchie's Snatch, which is a perfect Dick Tracy movie. Right down to, the core villain wearing those Coke bottle lenses so his eyes are bigger. And Brad Pitt's character, I mean, he's mumbles. Right? Brad Pitt is like doing mumbles. You don't know anything he says, right? That Snatch was the Dick Tracy movie. When I first experienced Snatch, I was like, that's what Dick Tracy should have been. And this is the Dick Tracy movie. So a lot of times the filmmakers just go for the superficials. They think of everything, if everything's primary colors and looks like a 4-color, Sunday page or comic book, that they've somehow transcribed something. Whereas Mario Bava with Diabolik understood the kinetics of the comic page. And Bava, like Frank Miller and Robert Rodriguez, because Frank Miller totally got what all of us try to do when we're working in comics, and Rodriguez totally got it too, is they put on the screen what we have in our head when we're drawing a page, right? And Bava understood. I'm not gonna make this look like that Little Abner musical from 1959.
We just did that one.
It's not about trying to replicate the flatness, because cartoonists are trying to create a 3-dimensional illusory reality there. And the action between the gutters is what Bava understood. John Philip Law's Diabolik is always moving, and that is the kinetics of how comics are read. It's a way of understanding the intent of the cartoonist, even when the skill set might not be there to realize it with the kind of of representational lucidity that a film can. And I have to say, I also really love the new Diabolic film. I finally got a copy out of Italy on DVD with English subtitles, and they did a great job. It's very different from the Bava film, but they really captured the essence of those early 1960s fumetti neri that the two sisters who created Diabolic had put into motion.
So did you find a copy with subtitles of the new one?
Oh, yeah. I found it on eBay. There's a couple of Italian editions.
Okay.
They're pricey because you're paying for the shipping from Italy.
Yeah.
But it's worth seeing. It's very good. It's essentially the origin of Eva.
Right.
And in fact, Eva Kant is more the protagonist of the Diabolic film than Diabolic is, because it's about the beginning of the relationship between Diabolic and his life's love, Eva. And it's a wonderful film. It's very different from the Bava film, but it should be very different from the Bava film, you know? So
Okay, excellent. Okay, this went as good as I imagined it was going to be. I knew you'd be a fount of information and
yeah, I'm sorry I go on with this shit. I'm also
no, this is exactly what I wanted.
Pandemic, we're all shut in. I'm having social contact with you, Kumar, you know, so feel free to tap me anytime. You know, the upshot, just to cap what we've discussing, the existence of Return of the Swamp Thing did boost DC's intentions for the Swamp Thing property. There were a couple of other factors. You can clock by the release of the Michael Zulli painting. It was a print that DC put out of Swamp Thing with the roses. And that marks the beginning of DC having regained their licensing. The contract had run its course with Melniker and Uslan. Now DC, you know, could begin to do prints and the limited edition figures and all that stuff.
No, I've got the statue of the Zulli painting here.
That was a few years after the print came out. But they based it on, and Michael Zulli's was a good friend of mine. We're still friends. We never had a falling out, but we haven't seen each other in ages. So that the existence of the Return of the Swamp Thing did elevate DC's perception of Swamp Thing having value beyond whatever value we had lent the property during our run on the book and what followed. The other thing that I would point out is that the question you asked me about the look of Dick Durock's Swamp Thing and Return of the Swamp Thing, everything since then has emulated that.
Yes.
Right. So Jim Wynorski embracing, you know, our approach to the character as being, okay, that's the model that we're going to work to, has carried on. And we have to credit Wynorski and Ed French for, now, you know, again, our friend John Bisson would have also done that, but he didn't have that opportunity. And so credit goes where credit's due. It was, you know, the creative combination of Wynorski as director and Ed French doing the makeup on Return of the Swamp Thing that really established for the mass media outside of the comic book reading public the look of Swamp Thing. And that's what they adhered to for the cable series, the public service spots, which in fact a lot of people saw more of the public service spots than ever saw that first series. And everything since then. So but you know, it also established unfortunately it also established that, well, we can lift what we want from the comic book series, but we don't have to adhere to it. There were a lot of things I enjoyed about the new series that only ran one season, but it was so frustrating to get to the tail end of the final episode after the credits, and we finally see Jason Woodrue in his all his glory, you know, the makeup, and the series is over. You know, it was like the worst porno movie ever made. Right? They're finally gonna have sex. Oh, the movie's over.
Roll credits. Canceled. Yeah. Okay.
But you know, Return of the Swamp Thing established that too. They had a lot of running time with the new series that they could have done a lot with. And they borrowed, as Wynorski had, they just sort of cherry picked. Oh, here's the anatomy lesson. You know, we'll have the dissection of Swamp Thing and so on. But they, you know, like Wynorski, they brought in a lot of elements that really had nothing to do with the Blue Devil and all that. I'm not sure what the idea was with that. So, for better or worse, Return of the Swamp Thing really is the multimedia template for everything that followed with Swamp
right.
Thing.
Yeah.
Really, really is.
Yeah.
And the only thing that really continued to carry over from the Wes Craven film was Arcane being, a variation on Louis Jourdan instead of the Arcane that Len and Bernie had created and the Arcane that Marty, Pasco, myself, and John Totleben carried on with, and that Alan took even further. And then Rick Veitch took even further with his run. None of that has been touched, with any of the media that followed. There you go.
Okay.
Any other questions, my friend?
No, that was it. I did remember that there's the where he gets blown up and he reforms in the bathtub and has a dramatic exit through the shower curtains. I was like, this is another, like Rites of Spring. It was like a really weird, watered down version of what was in the comics. But
yeah, it was more vivid than the little arm that grew on Dick Durock in the Wes Craven film. Yeah. That was one of the sadder moments. There was, I put out a book called Cryptid Cinema. Plug. Yeah. Here's a plug. I did a book called Cryptid Cinema that I think you can even get in Australia from Amazon.com.
Okay.
And in there, I have an entire chapter called Swamp Shit about the merchandising.
Yes.
And I have that chapter positioned very carefully because the next film I write about is a little made in Florida Fishman movie called Zat, which also is known as The Bloodwaters of Dr. Z. And I make the point that I think that some of the toy designs that came out of Return of the Swamp Thing and the animated show are closer to the Bloodwaters of Dr. Z than anything that ever appeared in any Swamp Thing comic book or property.
Right.
There's a whole lab where, the mad scientist who wishes he was a fish. It's more like the Incredible Mr. Limpet, only instead of Don Knotts, and the whole lab is just like that toy they put out of the mutation lab.
Yeah.
And even the Mantis Man that was part of that set really looks like a John Totleben drawing. It looks like one of our Unmen from issue 19 of Swamp Thing, the issue before Alan Moore came on. So you never know where this shit comes from. And hence the title Encrypted Cinema, Swamp Shit, because I kind of traced that stray lineage.
All right, that was the interview with Stephen Bissette, and thanks again to Stephen for his time.
Amazing.
He was really enthusiastic, and I was too. It was a joy. It was an hour of bliss. It was really funny and strange and interesting, and he's kind of a kindred spirit. I felt like
incredible.
We're looking at each other's offices.
All those insights, and all that. What a memory he has.
Yeah.
Just all those wonderful details and insights into the creative process and the vagaries of working for DC and Marvel. Just really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Steve.
Yeah. Okay, so
and now let's talk about. Now let's you and I talk about it, Kumar.
Yeah. So this is one of the first. I guess we had it with Little Abner too, where we didn't really know what to look at, what comics to look at before coming to the movie. So I suggested after watching the movie, maybe Rites of Spring, which is it's the key issue, I think that. So it's kind of in the middle of the run, or they've just gone through a whole mess of stuff, issue after issue of. Swamp Thing and Abby have gone through all this trauma together. She's a normal human being. It's been pretty full on. And then we have this kind of quiet issue in the middle with a painted cover, which I believe was stolen and still has not been recovered. I should have asked Stephen about that.
Next time, when we do Wes Craven's Swamp Thing, 1983, we'll get him back. No, but this, I think, Kumar, this is our first proper B movie. That we've done. Because I don't really consider Veronica a B movie.
Okay.
It's more like a Z movie.
Yeah.
This I think.
Foster. Where do you think that?
No, I wouldn't call that a B movie. No, that's more. I definitely file that. Well, B
all-star cast, yes.
Yeah. B for blaxploitation maybe, but not what I would call a so bad it's good kind of B
schlock.
grade.
It's schlock. It's
schlock.
This feel. I really felt like this was like all the producers and everybody was like chomping cigars and snorting cocaine. The entire production of this movie.
So this one, you can see. I think you can see conceivably enjoying it as a guilty pleasure because it's so camp. Some of the performances are just over the top. Heather Locklear's performance is incredibly bad. So the question is, like, can you sit? Is it like sitting down to watch Sharknado or
no?
What's one of those other films?
Okay, so
Miami Ninjas, which we watched a few weeks ago.
Miami Connection.
Miami Connection, that's it. The one with the Floridian ninjas.
There's two. Those are two different things because one is especially Sharknado because one knows what it is and one is sincere. Like Miami Connection was made by a man who believed in peace through martial arts and believed he was making a cool movie.
Yes. So.
Whereas Sharknado's like wink, wink.
Okay, Sharknado was not a good example. Okay, so but Miami Connection is a better example here. Is what I was kind of going for. So I mean, my question is, when it comes to this film, do I like it as a camp, so bad it's good, guilty pleasure, or do I dislike it because it's kind of crap and it kind of takes beats from a brilliant comic and completely doesn't understand them, and even like craps on them a bit.
I think it takes those beats and it knows. I think it knows it can't do Rites of Spring. So Rites of Spring is like a really beautiful issue of
we'll get to it. I've got a whole list of moments that we can get to.
But I think it like looks at that with its cigar in its mouth and is like, that's not the kind of movie we're making.
No, we're not making 2001.
We're making a 1950s monster movie, and we got to change this.
Yeah. It's not like interacting with the Black Monolith in 2001.
And it's not even trying to get to those. Yeah, it's not.
It's a soft lens. Well, look, we're totally going to get to it. But you see, this is partly the reason why this is so disappointing is because, as you pointed out, and as Steve pointed out, the story around this was that it was going to be more faithful to the comics. That was the rumor going around during its production.
Right.
I don't know. I doubt it was the way it was marketed, but certainly Peter David, whose novelization of the film you own, Peter David, comic book author and author of Star Trek novels, and I dug up a quote from him from I think his website. And he was writing about the experience of doing novelizations and comic adaptations of films. And he said, as to the Return of Swamp Thing, he said, the initial scuttlebutt that I'd heard about this film was somewhat positive. The costume was supposed to be less rubbery. Yep. Abby was supposed to be introduced, and there was going to be an attempt to be faithful to the Alan Moore version of Swamp Thing that was running on the currently running in the comics.
Okay.
And then he says, Barclay Books wanted me to do the novelization based on my comics experience, and I agreed to write it without first having read the script. Okay. Big mistake. Never, ever do this, especially if you've never heard of the director or script writer.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's worth just finishing the quote. They sent me the script, and I started reading it. By a third of the way through, I was having intestinal cramps. By the end of the script, I was bleeding out my eyeballs. I knew beyond a doubt that there was going to be a major problem. The script was as arch and campy as anything out of 1960s Batman. Mm. I think is a pretty good description. Swamp Thing acts like Batman. I think at one stage he's tossing grenades around.
He does throw grenades, and he drives a Jeep.
Yes, he drives a Jeep. It's just not forget Silver Surfer covered in snot. This is like Punisher covered in snot, almost.
Actually, that's a good comparison. What did I want to say? Oh, so about the novel, we're jumping way ahead.
It even has cornball lines. Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm still on here. So he even goes, they piped me in, When he materializes in the bathtub.
In the bathtub, and whips the shower curtain aside dramatically as the hero music plays.
What a scene.
Whenever he appears, it's like a low angle shot of something, and the hero music plays. It's not like a horror movie. It's like a hero movie. But the thing I want to say about the novel is Peter David actually tried to correct some of those things.
Yes.
So one of the things we haven't talked about is the Swamp Thing's voice. So for me, the thing that really freaks me out, and I watched this with my son, who read the entire run of. He's 15, and he read all of the Alan Moore Swamp Thing run, maybe like a year ago. And the first thing he said when he saw, and he loves watching bad movies, he was in disbelief when he heard Dick Durock's voice.
Yeah.
Because he has this very avuncular, friendly guy, you can call me Swamp Thing kind of voice.
Sounds like Captain America, I think, almost.
Yeah.
I came from the swamp.
So actually...
you can call me Swamp Thing.
Yes. So Peter David's fix that made it sound like the speech patterns from the comic.
This is important because Swamp Thing in the comic speaks in a very distinctive way.
Yes.
He speaks in measured, slow sentences of 2 or 3 words.
Well, it's hard for him to speak. Period.
Yes.
And in fact, initially he didn't speak. He was one of those monsters that was like Frankenstein's monster from the Universal version, which is just like he didn't speak. He could speak 1 or 2 words, but it was like hard, like it was a struggle for him. And eventually by Alan Moore's run, he could kind of make sentences, but it was still coming out very slow. So he's fixed that, and he's kind of tried to put a bit of the poetry back into it. And Alan Moore is a character. He's a motel owner or something in the
I've got to read this book.
So there's all sorts of crazy stuff in here. Anyway, so we've got this movie. It's directed by Jim Wynorski, who's directed 150 films, including some with such titles as Witches of Brestwick, The Bear Wench Project, and Cloverfield.
Oh my god!
But he directed Chopping Mall. Have you ever seen Chopping Mall?
Yeah, I've heard of. I haven't seen it, but I know of it.
It's his second movie, and that's a bonkers, crazy, worth a watch movie for sure. Written by somebody named Neil Cuthbert and somebody named Grant Morris. I stroked my beard. Okay, so it's got Louis Jourdan has returned from the first Swamp Thing movie. Now, I have to, if I can be allowed a digression.
By all means.
We know who Louis Jourdan was in my house because of Octopussy. So any movie that had like Indian people in it, in our house, that's like we're going to the cinema to watch that movie. My parents were like, we're going to go see Octopussy. There's a bunch of Indian people in it. So we knew who Louis Jourdan was. And that's why I saw Star Trek the Motion Picture, because Persis Kambata was in it. And they're like, there's an Indian lady in this movie. We're going to go to the cinema and see this movie. Okay, so that was my end of digression. I had forgotten that Sarah Douglas was in this. Completely forgotten. And I quite love her from Superman 2.
Right.
Dick Durock was a stuntman. He's in every iteration of these Swamp Things.
Yes. It's just remarkable.
Yeah,
he's quite charming, I suppose, but just so different from the character as written.
Yeah.
In the comics.
He is kind of able to express emotion through his eyes and face, though, somehow through that makeup setup. Heather Locklear.
Oh, man.
So
I read online this is the film that killed Heather Locklear's film career, to which I thought there was a film career.
Maybe she was trying to launch one, so I'm guessing she wanted to go from T.J. Hooker into movies and ended up going from T.J. Hooker to Swamp Thing to Melrose Place. I guess that's the trajectory that ended up happening. Yes.
Well, she won a Golden Raspberry for this film.
Okay.
with good reason, because it is a terrible performance.
Yeah, and Adrienne Barbeau was in the first one as this made up version of Cable. She wasn't Linda and she wasn't Abby. She was somebody called Alice Cable instead of Matt Cable.
Oh, so strange.
Very strange choice. I don't know, but she's like a great actress, So Heather Locklear, I actually think some of her lines are really funny in here.
I don't know. I think it's trying a bit hard.
No. I think like the line when the hired muscle meets her and says enchanté, and she says on parole.
More like on parole.
More like on parole. I love that line.
Okay, I laughed at it, but I wasn't laughing at it sincerely, Kumar. I was laughing at it because I cannot believe someone wrote that and thought it would land. And she does it all the time. She headbutts him and says he does some sort of, later on that same character is grappling with her, and he goes 10 months in Okinawa to talk about his training and his skills, and she headbutts him and says 2-day holiday in West LA or something that, and it's so cheesy. It's, oh god, I was laughing a lot during this movie, but not for the reasons they wanted me to. All right, should we talk about the plot somewhat?
Yeah, I guess so. Hang on, did I write anything about the plot? Okay, so it starts with some Treasury agents. So this is like an 85-minute movie. And there's a very long scene of these Treasury agents searching through the swamps, not a real swamp like in the Wes Craven movie, but like on a set swamp. Searching the swamps for some moonshine. Yep. Moonshine.
Still, yes.
And it's a very long scene, and they get attacked by an unman, a leech unman, who is very quiet and stalks them, but then suddenly attacks them and is then very loud. For some reason, I don't know why he was so quiet and then was suddenly so loud. Anyway, then Swamp Thing appears, and there's hero music, dun, da, 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 and they have a wrestle. They wrestle each other. Swamp Thing's suit looks really good.
It does.
And then he rescues one. I think maybe just something rescues one of the Treasury agents whose glasses fallen off, and he hands him his glasses, and then he's like, "What are you?" He's like, "You can call me Swamp Thing." And then we get an opening credits scene, which is awesome. An opening credits scene full of art from the comics and CCR's Born on the Bayou. And I made I made a joke when I was watching it that they must have spent the entire budget on the rights to that, but Stephen sent me right on that.
Of course, right? We heard the story there.
Okay, and then
we cut to Heather Locklear. Is she a florist?
She's a florist. She's doing transcendental therapy to get over her ex-boyfriends or something. Or she's into all kind of like homeopathy, kind of like very hippie-ish kind of thing. She doesn't look. She looks like she's from. She looks like Heather Locklear.
Yeah, she looks exactly like Heather Locklear. She's acting like sort of like a ditzy.
Yeah.
Valley girl almost.
But she has this. She takes care of her plants. Like she has a very sensual relationship with her plants. She strokes them and talks to them. Yeah,
we get a bare minimal. We get some very rushed characterization.
We get a joke about T.J. Hooker, which I laughed at.
I didn't. I rolled my eyes, much like the other character in that scene, the eye-rolling lady eating chicken soup at the desk. I feel you, lady.
Right. Then we get swipes to change scenes like we do in Star Wars. Yeah. We get these swipe transitions. We learned that Arcane is alive. I thought he was dead in the first one.
Oh, we can't talk about the first one because I haven't seen it.
Right. Well, my memory is that he died, and there is some kind of explanation in here about it. But initially, I was like, "Oh, it's just like Highlander 2. They just brought these."
He comes back from the dead. He was saved, but he's I think it's a plot point. He's saved, but he's unstable. His body is unstable, and that's what drives the plot. He needs the flesh of Swamp Thing and the blood of his adopted daughter or stepdaughter. To restore his health and youth.
And he's got this mansion, and it's surrounded by these armed guards, and there's a secret lab downstairs where he's doing this human experimentation, making these man-animal mutants. And I didn't realize until I rewatched this last week, but I ripped off this plot completely for my own novel, subconsciously.
Kumar. Oh.
It's not the only thing, because we were watching, a few months back when we watched Bob and Doug McKenzie's Strange Brew. My son was asking me about it. He said, "What's the plot again?" This is before we watched it. I was like, "Oh yeah, they're doing mind control on these hockey." He asked me about my book, And he said, what's it about? And I said, oh, yeah, they're doing mind control on this roller derby team. And he's like, oh, you mean like the hockey team in Bob and Doug? And I was like, oh, shit, yes.
Wow. All right, well, okay, the message here, people, is that if you want to really understand this podcast, you need to read Kumar's book.
Okay, so he's got these experiments going on. Now, so Abby comes out to visit him for some reason. I'm not sure, is she just trying to get away from it all?
Needs to get, well, it's introduced in the rapid fire characterization we get in 30 seconds at the beginning. Okay. She's never going to be able to settle down or to hang on to a man or what have you until she sorts out her relationship with her stepfather, which is the source of all of her present woes. Yes.
Okay. Got it.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
So and then that later transmutes into finding out what happened to her mother.
Right, okay.
But established that her transcendental therapist or whatever has told her over and over, she's been therapist shopping, and they've all told her the same thing. You need to resolve this situation with your stepfather in order to get any kind of peace of mind. And she goes, I just need to find a new therapist. And she goes, damn it, maybe they're right. I'm going to have to go and visit him. Make sure you water my plants and they love watching TJ Hooker and water them all the time and talk to them. Right. And oh God, it's just it's a terrible scene.
Okay, so she goes out there. Sarah Douglas is playing this character called Dr. Lana Zarels, who I guess is one of the maybe part of the she's one of the chief scientists or something. But she's also in a relationship, we learn, with Anton Arcane,
yes,
played by Louis Jourdan. And meanwhile, the leech monster is still running around the swamp.
Yes.
And knocks on the door of these two kids. And these kids, and one of the things I actually kind of like about this movie, I think these kids are wasted. You could cut every scene with these kids in it.
Yes.
But every side character, all these Bayou characters are all like Joe R. Lansdale eccentrics that are just weird, like extreme personalities. These kids are like, their whole thing is that one of their parents is out for the night, so they get all her dad's dirty magazines out. And then there's a knock at the door, and they open the door, and it's a leech monster.
Knocks on the door.
Why does he knock on the? I think they,
Jordan, he does pound on the door.
I think they know. Like, I think they know. I think they know this is ridiculous. I think at every step, every stage of this, I don't think these are Birdemic type mistakes. I think these are
Birdemic. That was the film I wanted to mention, not Sharknado. Birdemic.
Right.
Yeah, but yes. Look, I don't know. I think it kind of, yes, it's very camp.
Okay, so Swamp Thing shows up. He fights this monster. For some reason, it blows up every car in the trailer park. There's huge explosions all over the place.
These redneck kids are like, yeah! Oh no, that was my dad's car!
Yeah. The Swamp Thing fights are funny. The Foley is really fun because it sounds like skin hitting skin. And he's just punching these guys. He just stand there. It's like he's boxing them. The fight scenes were really funny. I don't know if those were intentionally funny or not.
No, I don't.
The way that the sound effects were just like, it just sounded like, normal punch sound effects. Okay, so Arcane figures out that because people are dying in the swamp, he figures out that Swamp Thing must still be alive. Alec Holland is still alive, and he wants him captured.
Yes.
He orders his goons like maybe 7 times in this movie to go out and capture Swamp Thing. It's like Megatron and Starscream, just over and over again. It's the same, get some new goons. Anyway.
Yeah.
He sends them out. I can't remember the order that things happen here. They take Abby hostage, or they're going to experiment on her.
Well, they decide they want Abby's blood because she's genetically identical to her mother. That's not how it works, but whatever.
Okay.
And they need a blood sample from her. They prick her with a ring. Her character's already changed from ditzy Valley Girl to intrepid lady reporter, almost.
Yeah.
She's asking all these hard-hitting questions about what he's doing in the bayou and what happened to my mother, and she won't take no for an answer. Anyway, then she puts on the ring, it nips her, they've got their blood sample, and she goes for a walk, and then there's some grody kind of hillbillies assault her.
Yes, they're making Moonshine. They're more Joe R. Lansdale characters.
Yeah.
They assault her. Swamp Thing comes to the rescue. He fist fights them again.
Yes.
Then, at some stage, Swamp Thing is found by Arcane, and they shoot him and they blow him up.
Yes.
Into a bunch of pieces.
They do blow him up.
Then Arcane is going to betray the Sarah Douglas character, we find out. And she overhears this, and her reaction is to decide to have a bath. Like, okay, I don't know why. She doesn't leave or anything.
Not that it's important, but she was running the bath before he tells her to go have a bath. You know, this isn't important, but...
Well, it's important because Swamp Thing reforms and comes out of that bath.
Sorry. The order of events isn't important. She runs the bath.
He punches the shower curtains open dramatically in a low-angle shot and steps out of the bath, just like Swamp Thing does in the comic books in every issue. And then there's a huge fight, and then he drives a Jeep, and he goes into the woods with Abby, and he goes into the swamp with her, and he has a big laugh. She says something that makes him laugh, and he says, I haven't laughed like this in a long time. And actually, he's had lots of laughs the whole movie. He's been smiling and chuckling here and there.
Then you have the Rites of Spring scene.
I wrote down slaves, because she says something about the slaves.
Yes, well, that's
yes, there's a line. There's a crazy line here. So something says this land used to be kept by slaves or something like that. And what was it? She says, I don't know how anybody could live here and not think it was beautiful.
Yeah, she says, they were rich. These slaves led miserable lives. And she goes, I don't understand how anyone could be miserable surrounded by this beauty.
Yes.
Oh, God.
Oh, my God. Wow, what a line.
How did that line make it in?
Then the kids are hanging. The kids are trying to get a photo of Swamp Thing so they can earn some money by selling it to the newspapers. There's a funny scene. Jourdan, I love this scene where the kids get their photo taken with Swamp Thing.
That's okay.
And he gives a thumbs up.
Yes, I did actually
the thumbs up at the end. When is
and the kids have got the lens cap on the camera, and I thought, is he gonna take the shot with the lens cap on? He's gonna take the shot with the lens cap on, and then Swamp Thing goes, you might want to take that lens cap off.
Yes.
And posing with the baseball bat, which he's just used to lay out some thugs.
Yes.
That I did enjoy that. Yeah, if that had been the only scene with the kids, I think I would have been a bit happier because I found it a bit of a trial.
Yeah.
The redneck kids.
Now, there's an interesting scene where the two head thugs, I don't remember what the name of the male thug. His name was Gunn. And the female was called Miss Poinsettia, played by Monique Gabrielle, who's in a lot of B-grade horror movies in the 80s.
They have a silly scene where they show off one another's scars.
Okay, I need to talk about this. I actually think this is a good scene. And I'm wondering if this is the first time it's happening, because the same scene appears in Lethal Weapon 3.
Yes.
Where Mel Gibson and, who was the female lead in that? They compare scars, but it turns into foreplay.
Yes.
And then they start making out after they've look at the scar on my shoulder, and they're comparing each other. So I'm wondering if did that movie lift it from Return of Swamp Thing? Or is there an earlier example of this scene?
Oh, I was watching it. I was certain they were riffing on, because it gets so silly so quickly. They start with serious war wounds, and then it's this is where my
Motley Crue concert.
Yeah,
her last one is a Motley Crue concert. Yeah,
this is where I got bit by this boyfriend. And I feel like it must be taking the mick out of a pre-existing scene. So, but Lethal Weapon 3 didn't come out. What year did Lethal Weapon 3 come out?
I'm looking at right now. It was 92, and it was Rene Russo.
Of course it was Rene Russo, right? Well, okay. In a future episode, we'll come back to that question as to what is the origin of the showing off scars as foreplay scene.
Really curious about it. Yeah, because it seems amazing to me if the screenwriters of this,
if they originated it, I'll eat my hat.
Jeffrey Boehm and Robert Kamen.
I will eat my hat if they came up with that.
It's very curious. I like the scene. I think it's a funny little weird
I didn't
thing.
like it. I thought it was
I feel like I must have seen it after. I think I must have seen this movie after Lethal Weapon 3, though, and at the time.
Oh, right. It's a callback to that. Well, Yeah, I got what they were doing because it's been parodied endlessly.
Yeah.
But what was the originator? That's the question. Yeah. If it's this film, I'm retiring from podcasting.
So now Swamp Thing attacks the mansion for some reason. I can't remember.
He needs to rescue Abby. She's been kidnapped.
Oh, she's been captured again. The second time? Okay.
Yep. And they're getting ready to drain her blood and regenerate.
And the head scientist mutates. Dr. Rochelle mutates for some reason. I don't know why he mutated into a monster.
Well, it's the other the lady doctor's selective rebellion, where she doesn't, leave the mansion or anything. She hangs around.
Did she inject him with something?
She injects him with it. Okay, she pushes him into the cell and injects. Well, she doesn't push him in. They go into the cell together. She injects him with it, and then leaves. And you get
right. Okay, but it's too late. Abby is dead. But Swamp Thing takes her up to the swamp, and he does, much like Superman's magic memory amnesia kiss from Superman 2, he has this power we didn't know about, and he brings her back to life.
Imagine the good he could do with this power. And then she becomes part plant.
And it causes a flower to grow out of her foot.
Yes. Because there might be some side effects.
Yeah, it's an odd touch, but okay. And then it closes with the cover. The final shot is the cover of the final issue of the Bissette, Totleben, Veitch, Alan Moore run.
The Return of the Good Gumbo.
Yeah.
Yeah, they absolutely have not earned that. Yeah, but as you know from listening to the interview, Steve doesn't have a problem with it.
It made sense when he described it to me as the bookends are the comic, and I was like, okay, so they know they weren't doing the comic because the comic is in it. If you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They're like, yeah, we know it's not the comic. Here's the comic. And it's like, I'm trying to find another example of like a really great piece of literature that got turned into like a really crap movie that failed to understand the richness of the original. Like A Sound of Thunder. No, even A Sound of Thunder is not quite right. Something deeper and richer and more literary. Maybe like Romeo and Juliet.
Have we had anything on the podcast yet that qualifies? Well, nothing. Maybe Tamara Drew. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I know what you mean. I know what you mean. Now, I want to talk a bit about some of the beats borrowed from the comics.
Okay.
So the reason why I started with that quote from Peter David, where he says that it's going to be an attempt to be faithful to the Alan Moore version of Swamp Thing, but of course, where are the elements that are faithful to the comic, allegedly faithful to the comic, and what is hugely different? So I want to talk about those two things, and we can speak in reference to some of the issues that they're referring to.
Okay. All
right. So the most obvious one is Rite of Spring, which we've already started to discuss. So Rite of Spring appears about midway through the run. It's when they realize they're in love, and it's after they've gone through enormous tribulations and experiences together. In fact, Swamp Thing has rescued her from the afterlife itself. and she confesses to him that she loves him. And she says, she says, it's absurd. It's absurd. You're the way you are, and what could you couldn't possibly love me, could you? And he says deeply, silently, and for too many years. And it's just, and then she says, well, it's similar. It's sort of similar to the film, but only in a horrible way. He says, like that, like what kind of relationship can we have? How can we be together in the way people that love one another do? And in response, Swamp Thing gives a part of himself to her, and it looks a bit like a pear or a sweet potato.
Yeah, it's a tuber of some sort.
Some sort of tuber. So it doesn't look like a pear. It looks more like a sweet potato. And she takes a bite of it, and there's this series of wonderful drawings and pages and captions just about where she's tripping essentially, but there's more to it. She can see
like one with the earth and the universe and everything. She
can see what he sees. It's the way he sees the world, because he's a creature of nature, an elemental spirit that's in touch with all plants, with the earth, and she sees the world the way he sees it, and she sees herself the way he sees her, and she's beautiful, and it's such a wonderful book.
Yeah.
Now, in the film, okay, what happens instead in the film, Kumar? Would you like to tell us how the film chooses to represent this scene?
I talked about this with Stephen a bit.
You did.
So basically, he breaks off this piece of himself, which is very phallic.
It doesn't look at all appetizing. It doesn't look like a nice sweet potato.
Gag. It's a little quick momentary gag where she gasps when she sees it because it is phallic looking. It's like, what do you want me to do with that? And then he takes a bite himself, and then she takes a bite, and she hallucinates that he is a
handsome man.
Handsome man, yeah.
And which is just yeah. Well, he's just some model apparently. According to the internet, he and Heather Locklear did not get on at all, and he was forced to leave as soon as the scene was finished. But yeah, okay. So instead of all of this wonderful, splendid imagery like in 2001, instead we get a soft dissolve. So we have a soft focus lens.
Yeah,
it's the same place but with a soft focus lens, and Swamp Thing is now a good-looking, muscular man, shirtless man, who's embracing Heather Locklear, and they essentially kiss for a while, and then it cuts away.
Yeah.
And it just is just a terrible, terrible betrayal of everything that made that issue wonderful.
Yeah.
Swamp Thing does not become a man. They're not, it's the opposite. He's not a man.
You're right. It is the opposite, yeah.
And she becomes more like him. He doesn't become more like her. And it's just awful. It's so upsetting to watch.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's one area there. Okay. So there's that. Right. Rites of Spring. Okay. Some other moments where you could say maybe they were borrowing from. Swamp Thing carries the dead Abby out of the collapsing mansion.
Yeah.
Right. He stands with her on the porch, cradled in his arms. It's very like a similar scene in the comic where she has died, where Arcane has killed her in the comic, when he's currently possessing the body of Abby's husband, Matthew Cable. And he kills her and he walks out with her body. And it's similar visually, but that's the only way in which it's similar, right?
Yeah.
I think. What you mentioned, the slave plantation. There's an issue in the middle of the John Constantine arc, American Gothic, where the vengeful ghosts. I believe it is 2 issues where vengeful ghosts of dead slaves come back and begin reenacting a fateful slave rebellion. Yeah. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Again, it's a throwaway line, maybe like the T.J. Hooker line. I'm not even 100% sure that it was deliberate.
Well, I kind of think it is, because it's an acknowledgement that slaves worked that land, and I don't think they would have put it in unless they had read the comics, and I don't think they would have thought about it. I don't think it would have occurred to them.
Okay, but again, it's just the why bother?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Why bother? Okay, now this I might be drawing a long bow here, but at one stage the bad guy, Gunn, the goofy mercenary, confronts Swamp Thing with a chainsaw, which is sort of similar to something that happens early on in the books.
Yes.
Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Sounds familiar,
it's with Woodrue. A man tries to attack Woodrue with a chainsaw.
Okay.
Woodrue takes it off him easily, and then he gets ready to carve Swamp Thing up with it.
Okay.
And that's the point, yeah. But I think maybe, like it could be, again, like this, it could be a reference, it could just be, I mean, where did he get that chainsaw? Why is there a chainsaw?
Yeah, well, sometimes it's like, where did the grenades come from? Sometimes people have weapons in this movie, and it's just like, I don't know where they picked that. And Ashton, my son, all the time every time somebody had a weapon, he's like, where did they get that one from?
Yes. Well, he had a chainsaw. And maybe just because Swamp Thing's a plant, but, or maybe they flicked through the comic and saw the bit where Woodrue whips out a chainsaw.
Yeah.
And he's getting ready. Actually, he's getting ready to attack. No, I think he's attacking Abby with it. He's attacking Abby with it, not Swamp Thing. Okay, so like that's drawing a very long bow. All right, one more, Kumar. Please indulge me with one more.
Okay.
All right, this is another one which upsets me.
Yeah.
At the very end of the film, after Swamp Thing has brought Abby back to life, they're lying on the ground and embracing. And then those fucking kids show up again.
Yeah.
And they get their photo.
Yeah.
Right? They get their photo, and it's of Abby and Swamp Thing embracing.
Yeah.
And this, for me, is too much like...
Okay, yep.
You see where I'm going with this?
Yes, I know where you're going. Keep going.
All right. This is too much like something very important that happens in the book, which is that a sleazy photographer finds Abby and Swamp Thing in the swamp, and Abby is essentially frolicking with Swamp Thing. She strips off and goes for a swim with him, and they're frolicking and playing, and this sleazy photographer takes photos of her, and they are used as evidence that Abby is, how would you put, committing bestiality.
Like they put her on trial for bestiality, and
they put her on trial for bestiality. Yeah. And and it's the kid. It's the same thing. The kids are taking this.
That didn't occur to me, but you're right.
So maybe
bad. No, that's really bad. I think you're right. I think you're 100% right. It is reminiscent of that, and it makes it's really bad by association because of how serious that storyline was.
It's incredibly serious storyline.
And the issues that Alan Moore was trying to address there.
Yes.
About two consenting sentient beings in a relationship with each other.
Yes. Exactly. Well done. Couldn't have put it better. So that I found that upsetting, actually.
Yeah, actually, you've upset me now thinking about it.
I'm so sorry, Kumar. You were enjoying the film, and I've ruined it for you. I'm sorry.
I wouldn't. You haven't ruined it for me, but that
of course
certainly added to the ruination. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
Well, I would say that another thing is the way he reforms in the bathtub. So he kind of comes in as this black soup, this goopy stuff that appears through the drain in the bathtub, and then there's this kind of misty fog, and then he reforms. I mean, there was no reforming prior to the Alan Moore run. He couldn't make a new body for himself. So that
it was his only body. Yeah. Oh, which brings me to another. Okay, points of difference come up. First,
let me get one more point in. The suit, the leafy suit. The leafy suit, I believe to this day looks good.
Yes, it does look good. I agree.
And it looks like the Swamp Thing that I love.
Yes.
That's all I'll say about it. Yeah.
Yes, I would agree. That's faithful, at least in a visual sense, in terms of how it looks like more like Swamp Thing than Wes Craven's one, who looks kind of like Toxic Avenger.
Yes. Yes.
But okay, so points of difference.
Okay.
So here we're moving on from the alleged connections to points of difference. The first and foremost, the most important one in this film, and presumably the preceding film, Swamp Thing is Alec Holland, right?
Yeah.
He's Alec Holland. Whereas, no, because in the comic, he's the whole. It's the defining kind of. It's how it begins with the anatomy lesson, right?
Look, that's a big jump. I don't think you can expect the movie. That's a whole movie in itself, or a season of a TV show. Well, I haven't seen the show that came out a couple of years ago. But I think that's like taking the third or fifth storyline and putting it in the first or second movie. It's like Crisis on Infinite Earths or something like that. You know what I mean? It's something that would come later, not in the early episodes. Even Alec thought he was Alec. Something thought he was Alec Holland himself. So I wouldn't fault the movie for that. Okay, go to your next one.
Okay, good. All right, we'll move on from that. Okay, the fact that we've already covered this, but the fact that Swamp Thing talks like the way he does, and
for me that's a big sticking point for me.
Yes. Yeah. I also have here Abigail's character's all wrong. We've talked about that her character. She has a very deep characterization.
She's very down to earth. She's not like a airheaded kind of.
She's not ditzy. She works with children.
Faux hippie, yeah. She works with learning disabilities and stuff. Yeah. She's
maternal, but also decisive, thoughtful, passionate. She's very, very interesting and rounded character. Pretty much the second most important character in the whole of that run.
Yeah.
Maybe Constantine is also important, but
pretty much.
I
would even argue she's the most important character in the Nancy Collins run that came later.
Okay, I've only read the Alan Moore one, so that's only what I can talk about. But all right, okay. As we've talked about, they fall in love instantly instead of at the culmination of many experiences where they fall in love. Swamp Thing is shooting guys like the Punisher, driving jeeps around, throwing grenades. We've covered that. My final point... And
you know what? I would say that during the Marty Pasco run, up to issue 19, he was, like, hopping trains like a hobo and riding the rails. You know what I mean? Like, he had to get around in cars and stuff. People had to drive him places. He couldn't just reform.
As I say, I've only read the Alan Moore one where he's this nature spirit and not a man. So I have a bias there because I've really only read Alan Moore's one, and I just love I just love them. As you know, I go back to them constantly. It's the one comic I just reread over and over and over.
Yeah.
My final point is the character of Arcane.
Okay.
He's nothing like his comic book counterpart.
No.
His comic book counterpart is sort of like a evil science wizard that casts.
He was not even a science wizard. Initially, he was a wizard. So in the Wrightson run, he was like a wizard in a castle in this European, nondescript Transylvanian type country. And he wanted to switch bodies with Swamp Thing, so he would have a super strong body. He was casting magic spells to do this.
I see.
And then he died off. He came back as this kind of demonic entity. He went through all these sort of transformations and stuff.
He's like pure evil in the Alan Moore run, or in the run in the 80s with Stephen and Rick Veitch and Alan Moore. He's like pure evil, and he looks horrifying. He's got like this hair lip.
Yeah.
And like this pointy bald head, and one of his eyes is either fallen out or it's become a bug eye or it's got wires coming out of it.
Yeah, and he just looks this kind of spider being.
Yes, he's just horrifying, and he's behind all this evil in the first few issues.
Yeah,
and he possesses the body of Abby's husband and sleeps with her, and it's like he's just evil.
Yeah.
In this show. In the film, he's not like that at all. As you can see, he's kind of more like he's just sort of like a rich guy that
he's a
wants
mad
to
scientist
live forever.
Type. Yeah.
Do you know who he made me think of? He made me think of Sunderland, the old man from the Anatomy Lesson.
Yeah.
So he rich guy who has his goons that go out and do his dirty deeds for him.
Yeah.
I just thought, why not make him Sunderland instead of Arcane?
I don't know. He's the one of the carryovers, as Stephen said, from the Wes Craven movie.
Okay, so I have to plead I have to plead ignorance because I just haven't seen the Wes Craven movie. But I think Sunderland would have been
also,
more...
but I think that would be that's the kind of thing you could do him now. It's like you'd have to have a lot of CG and stuff. It's a very complicated job. This is a low budget movie. Like it was never going to happen that they would have a full on Spider Arcane or whatever running around.
Well, yeah, that's it. Wait, so make him.
And, as Stephen pointed out, he's Wynorski was trying to basically make a kids movie. So you're not going to have this super scary Arcane and all this incest and child molestation happening.
Well, that's why I say, yeah. So just like they could have just made him a different character, I think. Because we're talking. I'm judging this film, perhaps certainly wrongly. But the angle that I've chosen to go with for this discussion is how closely it hews to my beloved 80s run.
Yeah.
Because that's what Peter David even said. That's the kind of like the interpretive framework I've decided to go with to fuel this discussion. And you've been very forgiving by letting me talk for so long.
No, absolutely. All right, well let's wrap it up.
Very good. All right. Kumar, would you recommend reading the comics.
Oh my God! Yes, they're the best comics there. Like, there's other best comics, but they are also the best comics.
Yeah.
And issue after issue,
there's nothing better.
My mouth is open every time I read them. It just shock at how what a perfectly functioning. All the wheels are turning the way they're supposed to be turning. Everything's working together.
It's such a wonderful work of art, and and so significant. I mean, it's the comic that killed the comic book code.
Yeah.
It's the comic that ushered in.
Anyway, yeah.
It's the comic that ushered in the wonderful kind of myth making and canon welding that we talked a bit about on Deconstructing Comics with Neil Gaiman's efforts with Black Orchid and things like that.
Yeah.
You bringing back going through the huge gallery of characters that Marvel and DC have and creating a wonderful new mythos with them. There'd been stuff like that before, but this is the comic that really did it best.
Yeah.
And so read it. Yeah. Oh God, go and read it. Stop listening to us and go and read it right
now. Okay, movie. Yay or nay?
No, don't watch it. No, that's a nay for me. It's not camp enough to be funny. It's not funny enough to be funny. I say avoid. Nay.
I'm gonna say nay. I think there's some funny bits in it. I think you should look at some pictures of the suit online or something.
Oh, hang on, Kumar. Is it the same suit in the PSAs?
I think it is.
Well, then watch the PSAs because they're hilarious.
The PSAs are really good. I will also say that this also led to a TV series that ran for 3 seasons and 60 episodes, and an animated series which was only 5 episodes, but led to a line of action figures. And I've got those Swamp Thing action figures, and those figures are awesome. And I'm very grateful. I am very grateful that those figures, to the cartoon for giving me the figures, and for the movie for giving me that cartoon so that I could have those really cool figures that are like, they make more sense than like the Batman figures where he's got 50 different costumes, because he can actually reform as like different types of trees and stuff. And it's more like the comics than, I haven't seen the cartoon, but it's more like the, so, I'm grateful.
We're glad the film exists, but don't watch it.
Yeah, maybe don't watch it. I mean, watch Chopping Mall for sure. I would recommend above Return of Swamp Thing. And there's other better, I think it's similar to Veronica, there's other better B-movie stuff or incompetent stuff that's worth watching. Okay, adaptation, yeah or nay?
I hope I've created no doubt in anyone's mind that it's definitely a nay.
It's a hard nay. I really am curious about what it would look like if you've never read the comic before. And if you would enjoy it more as a B movie, more as a schlock B movie if you'd never read the comics and not.
I think that's a fair point. I think I would have enjoyed it more if it wasn't a comic I loved.
That makes it more of a nay as an adaptation, because it's
absolutely.
In order to enjoy it, you have to have not read the comic.
Yes.
Okay, so next week, as I mentioned it in my interview with Stephen, but I don't know if I'm going to cut it or not. We're going to talk about the Prince Valiant movie from 1954. So a few weeks ago, you were like, "Hey, are we going to talk about some horror movies?" Or you said we need our. The joke on Deconstructing Comics is that we need a bell to be rung every time anyone says Alan Moore or H.P. Lovecraft. And you said, "Are we going to get a bell for the show?" I said, "We're not going to do any horror movies, so I don't think that we're going to need a bell for H.P. Lovecraft." But then I thought, actually, there's a couple, and Veronica was one.
Yeah.
Swamp Thing is kind of another. But then last week I said, "What do you want to review?" And you said, "Oh, let's do a fantasy film." I said, "I can't think of any comics to movie fantasy film except for Prince Valiant."
Valiant it is.
We're going to do 54 Prince Valiant, and then we're going to do 97 Prince Valiant the week after, I think.
Oh, fantastic. Okay.